Hello and welcome everyone. My name is David Graeber. I'm a professor of Anthropology and Social Change at the California Institute of Integral Studies, department that David Graeber was, I have to credit David for participating in co-designing it. In those first days, David would receive many messages from me asking for help. And in terms of curriculum design, in terms of many other things. And he just told me, I remember just American expression, go for broke. I said, David, what do you mean? He said, they're giving you all this space to do these things about anarchist anthropology. So why don't you just call it anarchist anthropology and start giving all these funky and funny names to the classes and courses and start hiring unorthodox, unusual people like Professor Targo Mesbah, who is joining me, and Professor Michelle Glowa, Sean McCracken, and many others from our department, affiliate members. And I said yes. And David Graeber, absolutely not only amazing, but also very dedicated in helping us. And he gave the first lecture. It was on his book, Debt. And it was a lecture that was formal inauguration of the Department of Anthropology and Social Change. Now, many years later, we are brought here by an occasion that it's still very hard to actually talk about, which is David's passing, and effort of several of the departments, whom, as we like to say, borrowing this from our friend John Holloway, one of the co-organizers, together with his University of Puebla, with all the universities and university departments who misfits, who are trying to do something else. We're trying to create a coalition of people, of departments, of universities, who are doing something to honor David's vision, to create an anthropology, but not just anthropology, it's social science that stands in active opposition to the world that it is, but also that is trying to create, David loved this, prefiguration, to prefigure a new world, a different kind of relating. And it is a great joy and great pleasure to introduce David Wengrow, who is our speaker today in this third annual David Graeber Memorial Lecture. Our first lecturer was Al Pasha, second Michael Hart, and now we are very lucky and honored indeed to have David Wengrow, who was, and I will say, and David will probably be grateful for me pointing this out, greatest, one of the most beautiful ways and accurate ways to introduce him, goes to say that he was co-author, but more than anything else, friend, a very, very dear and close friend of David Graeber. So I won't take any more of your time. There will be plenty of time for conversation later. And David is invited to give a talk. He had chosen a title and a topic that was very close to both Davids. So when I teach your book, David, I usually say David and David. Somebody was laughing and said, it's like Dolce & Gabbana. I said, no, not really. It's David and David. So let me then just shut up and allow me to then introduce David Wengrow. And before that, just to thank Simone, who actually, I just forgot, I apologize, Simone, you will tell us something about the translation and about the techniques of our Zoom conversation today.
Yes, I will. Thank you, Andre.
Okay, and I'm going to mute myself and yes.
Hello, everyone. Bonjour tout le monde. Hola, compañeros y compañeras. Mon nom est Simon Tremblay-Pepin. Ça fait plaisir d'être avec vous. Nous avons de la traduction pour les personnes qui parlent français lors de cette présentation. Vous pouvez l'avoir avec le bouton Interprétation au bas de votre écran et vous aurez de la traduction en français. Compañeros y compañeras que hablan español, hay traducción, interpretación a vivo en esta conferencia. Entonces, ten un botón abajo de su tela que puede ayudar para la interpretación. Entonces, merci. Thank you, everyone. Gracias. En una buena presentación.
Okay. I hope I'm audible. If anyone could nod, thank you very much. As Andre has said, it remains unthinkable, to me at least, that David Graeber is gone. His death still fills me with shock and regret, which, like so many other people, I've tried to channel into a celebration of his life and work, in the sad and certain knowledge that David was only just beginning to enter the full force of his own ideas. I would contend that the world, not just the world of academia, but in general, has an inevitable reckoning to come with David Graeber because of the clarity with which he diagnosed the social illnesses of our time and the fearlessness with which he pursued remedies and alternatives, retaining a sense of optimism and humor in the face of professional injustices and personal attacks, which sadly continue even after his death. We can safely conclude, I think, that the attacks have failed because David's work is now more widely read and discussed than ever before, crossing social and international lines that I think even he would have found difficult to imagine, while these sticks and stones can no longer hurt him. About a year ago, I found myself in a workshop at a prestigious American campus of exactly the kind that turned its back on David Graeber at one of those points in his life when he found himself vulnerable, without an academic position. There were many such campuses. At the workshop, a colleague asked me, how is it possible to write a densely referenced 700-page tome on archaeology and anthropology, which is also a bestseller, read in multiple languages across the world? I explained that the answer is simple. There's no trick or strategy. There's just David Graeber, who really was that rarest of things, a person trying to live his ideas rather than just write about them. In the later years of his life, David embraced the revolutionary movement and democratic initiatives of the Rojava cantons, and I am deeply honored to be giving this talk at the joint invitation of the University of Rojava, where I believe a lecture theatre bears David's name. I'm only sorry not to be there in person. Before moving on to the substance of my talk, the third freedom, I want to say a few brief words about the place of Rojava in my own relationship with David. When I first got to know David, it was around 2010, I was actually reading the works of Abdallah Öcalan as part of my own preparation for archaeological fieldwork in the Halabja district of Iraqi Kurdistan, the so-called hilly flanks of the Fertile Crescent, where we were investigating those earliest Neolithic civilizations, which hold such a prominent place in Öcalan's thought. Over the years that followed, and in which we worked together, David's own interest in this region grew rapidly. He visited Rojava and wrote a preface to Volume 1 of Öcalan's Manifesto for a Democratic Civilization, The Age of Masked Gods and Disguised Kings. It remains one of my favorite pieces by David, a profound reflection on the revolutionary potential of the social sciences. It also reflects exactly the kind of animated conversations that we were just beginning to have around that time, which culminated 10 years later in the publication of The Dawn of Everything, A New History of Humanity. In that preface to Öcalan's work, David writes, and I want to quote a bit, Some of the most vital, most creative, most imaginative revolutionary movements at the dawn of the new millennium, the Zapatistas of Chiapas being only the most obvious perhaps, have been those that simultaneously root themselves most strongly in a deep traditional past. There was, David writes, a growing recognition in revolutionary circles that freedom, tradition, and the imagination have always been, and presumably always will be, entangled in one another in ways that we do not completely understand. Our theoretical tools are inadequate. Perhaps the only thing we can do, he says, at this point, is to return to the past and start over. With this in mind, I now want to explore the place of freedom as concept and as practice in my joint work with David Graeber. In our co-authored book, The Dawn of Everything, David and I describe three basic forms of human freedom. We argue that in various configurations, to varying degrees, these freedoms were available to a great number of human societies across the span of our species' history, extending back into the most distant past. We also argue that today, these freedoms have been largely erased from the lives of most people on the planet, to the extent that it's difficult for most of us now to even imagine what it might be like to live in a world based on such principles. The three freedoms I refer to are the freedom to move away, the freedom to disobey, and the freedom to imagine and enact alternative forms of social existence. The erasure of these freedoms is, we suggest, a relatively recent feature of world history. It can only be understood in the context of the last half millennium or so of land enclosure, mass enslavement, plunder, and spiraling wars of destruction, accompanied by the growth of new regimes of private property, credit, and debt, along with systems of territorial sovereignty and surveillance that would have been beyond the wildest dreams of any ruler or emperor of an earlier era. Of course, the last 500 years have also witnessed the global rise of capitalism, the Industrial Revolution, and the growth of representative democracy in various parts of the world. We might be tempted to see a paradox here. How can the rise of democracy be coeval with an unprecedented loss of human freedoms? It is precisely this paradox that works with such, I think, self-explanatory titles as Eric Williams' Capitalism and Slavery, or Michael Mann's Dark Side of Democracy, Explaining Ethnic Cleansing, or Tyler Stovall's White Freedom, The Racial History of an Idea, or indeed David's own brilliant essay, There Never Was a West, or Democracy Emerges from the Spaces in Between, that works like these have done so much to clarify and dispel the apparent paradox. They oblige us to recall the human cost of modern capitalism and industrialization, to remember the many local and indigenous forms of direct democracy that were eradicated to make way for representative democracies in the service of expanding nation states and corporations. They ask us to remember how, from the mid-19th century onwards, the self-identification of European powers as democratic went hand in hand with their largely unqualified, economically motivated support of regimes that were actively suppressing democratic reform among much larger populations overseas, sowing the seeds of so many contemporary crises. And they ask us to reflect on how all of this relates to the erosion of freedoms inside our own democracies, reducing those freedoms to largely transactional values. the freedom to expand one's purchasing power, to defend one's property, to sell one's labor to the highest bidder. For all these reasons, it is important to underscore that the three freedoms we define in The Dawn of Everything are not simply individual freedoms. Freedoms conceived in purely individualistic terms can quickly morph into microforms of domination and already assume the existence of an infrastructure of punishment and coercion to enforce them. Nor are we talking about freedom as an abstract concept. We're talking instead about concrete social freedoms, which also enable the freedoms of others, which is to say they presuppose the existence of a different kind of material infrastructure to that of the state, and a different sort of morality to the morality of capitalism, with its familiar atomizing effects. The first freedom, to move away from one's surroundings, can only become a lived reality if there also exist robust networks of hospitality and asylum through which individuals can move, finding shelter and protection along the way. One of the clearest illustrations of this that David and I came across is the concept and practice of Wunan, developed by indigenous thinkers in Northwest Australia. I should add, we didn't actually find a place in the book for this particular case, which we had intended toward the end of David's life. We wanted to try and find out much more about it and educate ourselves and include it in some future still imaginary sequel. In fact, this concept called Wunan is incredibly complex. European anthropologists used to use the term actually to refer to two apparently quite different things. First, there was a system of making images. These were paintings on natural rock surfaces distributed across the ancestral landscapes of the West Kimberley in Northern Australia. But they also used the term to describe a system of what we might call hospitality zones, traversed by indigenous people from some hundreds of different communities. In anthropological parlance, this forms a web of overlapping clans and moieties which outspan local groups, making sure that everyone has potential hosts in distant locations. In the course of asserting their native title over their lands, Garinian intellectuals have recently made a point of explaining to Western researchers that actually Wunan means even more than all this. Above all, they emphasize it is a code of law, a code that is impressed on the landscape through the medium of images, and which can only be learnt by moving through it. At the same time, it is also, and I'm quoting now, a set of prescriptive and proscriptive rules of civilized behavior, the most prized possession of a Garinian adult. And I'm quoting here a senior lawman, the late David Mawaljalai, who argued explicitly that Aboriginal civilization is built on this particular combination of aesthetic, topographic, and moral principles. And he contrasted this with the economic principles that govern and encompass white people's relationships to the land. Similarly, the second freedom, to disobey arbitrary commands, can only become the basis of a functional social order when accompanied by the cultivation of other psychological and personality traits, which tend towards toleration, persuasion, and reasoned argumentation. In The Dawn of Everything, we explored the historical case of encounters between European colonizers and the indigenous societies of the eastern woodlands of North America, specifically the Great Lakes region. Jesuit missionaries such as Gabriel Sagal, whose 1632 work, Le Grand Voyage du Pays des Hurons, influenced John Locke and Voltaire, often marveled at the facility of native people for skilled oratory and debate, while at the same time being openly hostile to the obvious freedom and even playfulness of their social arrangements. How could such facilities for reasoned argumentation have possibly come to those with no awareness of the works of Plato, Varro, Quintilian, and all the rest? In considering the matter, Jesuits almost always noted the openness with which public affairs were conducted. So writes Father Lejeune in the 1630s, and I quote, "There are almost none of them incapable of conversing or reasoning very well and in good terms on matters within their knowledge. Their councils held almost every day in the villages and on almost all matters improve their capacity for talking." A little over 10 years later, it was Lejeune, again, writing now in 1642, who most clearly perceived the logical connection between reasoned debate, personal freedoms, and the refusal of arbitrary power. They imagine, he wrote of the Montanese Scapi, that they ought by right of birth to enjoy the liberty of wild ass-colts, rendering no homage to anyone whomsoever, except when they like. They have reproached me 100 times because we fear our captains, while they laugh at and make sport of theirs. All the authority of their chief is in his tongue's end, for he is powerful only in so far as he is eloquent, and even if he kills himself talking and haranguing, he will not be obeyed unless he pleases the savages. Now, at least some Jesuits clearly recognized here an intrinsic relationship between what we call the second freedom, to disobey, and a taste for reasoned argumentation, accompanied by open and inclusive public debate. And this fact alone seems to have been very important, because it seems to be exactly this style of debate, rational, empirical, skeptical, and conversational in tone, which before long came to be identified with the European Enlightenment as well, traveling west from the Americas, along with such all-consuming habits as smoking tobacco from pipes and socializing with caffeinated beverages. And of course, Enlightenment thinkers and democratic revolutionaries also saw it as intrinsically connected to the rejection of arbitrary authority, especially the authority of the church. Historians and ethnographers from Francis Laflèche to Willard Rawlings have noted how in the history of the American Midwest, migration was often conceived as the restructuring of an entire social order, merging the three elementary freedoms into a single project of emancipation, to move away, to disobey, and to build a new social world. What we would now call social movements often took the form, quite literally, of movements through a landscape. Now, if such freedoms existed until relatively recently, among people forced to survive in the dwindling cracks of the modern world system, how then should we imagine the greater part of human history before the expansion of racial capitalism and imperial systems of domination? One of the main arguments of the dawn of everything is that for some time now, the writing of human history and social science on a large scale, the creation of what we might call grand narratives, has converged around a simple task, which is simply to stop us from imagining those kinds of things at all, or rather confine our imaginations to a series of stark alternatives and false binaries. Were we originally egalitarian or hierarchical? Were we cooperative or competitive? Were we kind or were we selfish? And so on, which make it impossible to even perceive, let alone understand, the true complexities of human social life outside the canonical history of states and empires, as these reveal themselves to us through such things as archaeological science and other modern methods of investigation. Now, by this stage, you may well be asking yourself, how on earth is it possible to study something like freedom in past societies, where the only evidence of social life available to us may be material traces in the landscape, or prehistoric images, or burials, tools, buildings, ornaments, and other such artifacts? In answer to which, and I'm not being glib here, I would just make the obvious point that archaeologists experience no such difficulty studying systems of domination and control in equally remote periods of human history, using exactly the same kinds of evidence. Some time after David died, so suddenly and inexplicably in Venice, I discovered something strange, a sort of conceptual scaffold on which to hang our concept of the three freedoms, which I'd like to share with you today. It came, to my surprise, from the writings of Friedrich Nietzsche, specifically the three metamorphoses which open the discourses of Zarathustra upon his going down the mountain. I don't recall ever discussing it with David, but I wouldn't be at all surprised if it had a home somewhere in his extensive mind palace. Doesn't really matter now. But the images, I think, do matter because they're powerful and they convey better than words the kind of conceptual problems that I feel we're grappling with here. Nietzsche's three metamorphoses are the changes undergone by the human spirit as it becomes in turn a camel, a lion, and then a child. The camel is the load-bearing spirit. It takes upon itself heavy things and hastens into the wilderness, where it undergoes a second metamorphosis into the lion. Freedom will it capture, writes Nietzsche, and lordship in its own wilderness. There in the wilderness, the spirit encounters the great dragon with its golden scales, whose name is "Thou shalt," but to whom the spirit, in the form of a lion, replies, "I will." But neither the power of the lion nor the camel can match the ultimate claim of the great dragon, which is, and I quote, "that all created values are in my body of gold, and all values have already been created." To create new values, says Nietzsche, that even the lion cannot yet accomplish. But to create itself freedom for new creating, that can the might of the lion do only by turning itself into a child. The final metamorphosis. For what can the child do that neither the lion nor the camel can achieve? It can make a new beginning and start again, the game of creating. Now let's recall that the power of the great dragon, its gift of arbitrary command, lies not just in the blinding glare of its golden scales, but also in their antiquity. All values have already been created, and all created values do I represent. The values of 1,000 years glitter on those scales. The dawn of everything, as I see it, is a project of reclaiming time, and so also making space for other values and other questions. To attempt this, I suggest we cannot confine our vision of human possibilities to just the last few centuries of history, with their failed utopias, foreclosed accounts of human nature, and ideological castles built on sand or in the sky. Today we have a much larger canvas of empirical, historical evidence to draw upon, and a considerably richer archive of human experience to consult. Whole spaces of the past that were supposedly well-defined the nature of human social life before the invention of agriculture, the consequences of farming and urban life, the origins of kingship and the state, the history of democracy. All of these are open, once again, to reinterpretation. And the main reason for this is a flood of new information rushing in from every quarter of the globe to assail and occasionally explode the tacit schemes of social evolution and stadial or stage-based reasoning, which despite decades of theoretical critique, continue, I think, to represent the deep structuring principle of most large-scale thinking about the human past. Actually, all of this was anticipated a long time ago by a brilliant archaeological theorist called David Clarke. Back in the 1970s, he predicted that with modern research, quoting Clarke now, almost every aspect of the old edifice of human history, the explanation of our species' biological evolution, the birth of agriculture, metallurgy, urbanization, and civilization would, he says, in perspective emerge as just so many semantic snares and metaphysical mirages. In The Dawn of Everything, we conclude that basically he was right. Scientific findings of the last few decades really have overturned just about everything we thought we knew or inherited, largely unthinkingly, from a previous age of social theory. Questions that once seemed beyond the range of investigation are now open to scrutiny, and not surprisingly, perhaps, the emerging picture of human history looks almost nothing like speculations handed down to us from the philosophers of the European Enlightenment. Millennia of human experience reclaimed from the dragon of time. But the evidence clearly does not ever speak for itself. We're talking, after all, about prehistory, prehistoric archaeology, the art and the science of interpreting evidence without verbal or written testimony. Evidence refers to material culture, as well as data pertaining to past environments. But evidence without testimony is always underdetermined. Or as Clarke himself put it in another passage, archaeology in essence then is the discipline with the theory and practice for the recovery of unobservable hominid behavior patterns from indirect traces in bad samples. Quite funny, but not very encouraging. Such delicate traces of evidence can open up possibilities, but they can also constrain them. Without due care, the traces themselves can be all but obliterated by top-down, top-heavy theoretical constructs, by freewheeling speculation, or they can just disappear in a blizzard of Gini coefficients. Often, I think we treat indeterminacy as an invitation to patch over the gaps and the silences in the evidence with totalizing theories of social change. The alternative approach, which we took in The Dawn of Everything, is different, and it owes a lot to the critical realist philosophy of Roy Bhaskar, who David Graeber so admired. As David observed in his obituary for Bhaskar, left-wing thought in Europe, and to a large degree in social science generally, has traditionally divided itself into two camps. I'm going to quote David again now. There are the positivists, he says, who assume that since the world does exist, we must someday be able to have exact and predictive knowledge of it. And then there are the postmodernists, who believe that since we cannot have such knowledge, we cannot speak of reality at all, and are just rehearsing different versions of the same fundamental error. But in fact, he says, real things are precisely those whose properties will never be exhausted by any description that we can make of them. We can have comprehensive knowledge only of things that we have made up. Now, what might all this mean for our understanding of a deep, fragmentary, but increasingly knowable human past? Of course, there's no getting away from the fact that our knowledge of the past and of past social realities is severely limited by the nature of the evidence. But Pascal's perspective seems like a useful reminder that no human society has ever been so simple as to be fully comprehensible to its own members, even the most inquisitive among them. There have always been the perennial paradoxes of life and death to contemplate and contend with. In other words, no matter how far back we wish to go into the human past, we would always do well to keep in mind that those past actors' understanding of their own social reality would itself have been very far from perfect, total, or complete. And that each time we impose a neat or totalizing model onto the fragmentary remains of some past human activity, we also remove a little of its humanity, and therefore of its reality. Now, all of this might just sound like common sense, but compared to standard ways of writing and thinking about our distant human ancestors, it's actually a strangely radical position, for the simple reason that most such writing adopts a kind of as-if approach. Let's write about people in the past as if they lacked any capacity for self-reflection, moral judgment, or political consciousness at all, as if they spent all their time in just one form of social reality, as if they were not really capable of consciously transforming their worlds, as if they were corks drifting along an evolutionary stream that leads sooner or later from dispersed egalitarian forager bands to centralized hierarchical states. In short, as if they had already lost most of the freedoms that we now find so hard to reclaim. By resisting such teleological habits of thought, I suggest we may yet escape the great dragon of time and begin to see past the blinding glare of its golden scales towards another kind of social reality and a different vision of what it means to be sapiens. And here, by way of conclusion, I can't help but recall David Graeber's most often cited words, at once childlike and profound. The ultimate hidden truth of the world is that it is something we make and could just as easily make differently, which is, of course, the very essence of the third freedom.